So we just talked about business process policy, and now we're talking about types of policies and procedures. Policy, remember, that's a high-level statement. Procedure, that's a low-level, step-by-step kind of thing. And so your policy and your procedures, they need to match and talk about each other. The procedure derives its authority from the policy up above. If you have no policy that says we're going to prosecute, but you've got this procedure down here that says we're going to prosecute, you've got this inequity here, and when you go to a court of law, they're going to pull up your policy, they're going to pull up your procedure, they're going to say these two things match, do not match, this is not normal records keeping for your organization, and therefore we're going to throw this evidence out in a lot of cases. Okay, so let's start off with the high-level stuff. A mission statement about what we're doing in forensics, saying what the personnel requirements are. This is how many people on staff that we'll have. We'll have a senior person, 2 junior people. We'll have 2 photographers on staff, and on down the line. When we have submissions and retrieval of service requests, how do people engage with our forensics department? How do they ask them, hey, I need some help in this area? It may be that you're a large global organization and that you have a forensics team that needs to be deployed to a particular location, or what you do is you actually hire outsourced people locally for a short period of time to maintain the scene and keep the chain of custody, and then you fly in your super-duper team that comes from central HQ. How are they going to handle evidence? What do you do with that evidence? What are the procedures and the policies and the steps that work with your local jurisdiction? Because you've got to remember that. Development of the case processing procedures. How will you collect the case information? How will you process it? This is where in a lot of cases people go, I don't know how we're going to do case processing proceedings. And what they do is they reach out to a larger tool like FTK or InCase that has a lot of that stuff built into it. So even though the tool is really expensive, the case processing that goes along with it, since it's built into it, it makes you more efficient and more effective. Now, we need to develop these technical procedures, and this is going to come through a trial and error for your organization, because the thing that I do because I learned it at SANS, or because you learned it with me, or because I learned it from Casey or somebody like that, isn't going to work for your organization exactly, because your business process is different. So therefore, you're going to have to say, here are the general requirements that we're all going to follow, but this is the specific requirements of how we do these activities with the capabilities that we have on hand. Figuring out what the possible solutions are is another portion of this. You can say, okay, we've found fraud, or okay, we've found a hacker, what are we going to do about it? When it comes to fraud, we're going to turn it over to this department here. When it comes to hackers, for malware, we're going to turn it over to the patch management team here, or the security team. You've got to also test all your solutions and know a controlled sample. Let's go back to what I said before about collecting up your TechNet and having all your different installed operating systems for Microsoft or for Linux or whatever your organization is. You've got these clean reference systems over here that are perfect. Maybe you even have within your organization a perfect image. You say, this is our gold image that we deploy to each workstation. This is our gold image that we deploy to each server as a base image, and then we install the applications on top of that. That reference system there that you've already got in place, or maybe these are one-off servers, so you have to build up an extra copy of it, or they're VMs and you actually pull a copy there. These are our reference systems. They have not been tampered with and will reproduce this action here. That requires that you have a way to test, and you did that prior to getting anything going. Then you evaluate the test results, both positive and negative. You must assert on it. You must finalize the proceeding and say, this is what we did and this is what we got from it. Now, suppose you have people that come to your organization that sign an acceptable use policy within the organization, and they fail that acceptable use. They break the rules. What are we going to do? Well, I don't know. What should we do about it? And your forensic says, well, we're going to capture this information, and we're also going to let you know that you're being monitored, because in our forensics process, we monitor to this level. So we may not take any action, but we may inform them through our acceptable use policy that all activity will be monitored. In a lot of cases today, you may have heard of a company called Blue Coat that says, what we will do at the edge of the network is we will allow HTTPS to the edge of the network, we'll de-encrypt, inspect, and re-encrypt and send it on its way. Your acceptable use policy has to say, you have the right to surf, but we have the right to inspect, and we're using this technical tool here. You've added that language that allows you consent to monitoring, but then based on the consent to monitoring, that you're going to use that in investigations internally or use that in investigations for fraud externally. When you violate this, we have to make sure that the forensics examiners and investigators are called in to perform that internal assessment at that point. And they have to follow the standardized methodology. One of the key pieces in this standardized methodology is, let's say that we believe that this person did something wrong. One of the things that we do is we don't send the forensics investigator to interview them. We have a special human resources and legal team do the interview of those people, because they know what's legal, what's not legal, and these people over here only look at what's legal as far as evidence is concerned. Now, you may have trained investigators or interrogators in your organization that will be there along with human resources. By the way, this happens a lot in casinos. So they have a whole trained staff that does just this. Now remember, the motive behind the company policy violation investigation is not always to take punitive steps. It's not always to punish. It's to go ahead and involve somebody and say, okay, look, this is what we found. This is what you were doing. You have to stop this activity. What's really elegant about this is you can say up front to somebody, this was our agreement, and you've broken this agreement. Are you going to continue this activity at this point? Because if you want to continue this activity, that means that you really don't want to work under the conditions that we have in front of us. So what do you think? What do you want to do at this point? And they just wait. Sometimes, if you say it just right, the employee may quit. And that might be much more of an elegant solution than having to fire somebody, especially if you've got any kind of big problems when it comes to hiring and firing for your organization. We'll just leave it at that. Funding. No money equals no support. So we really believe, business process and procedure, we really believe in forensics. Okay, where's my budget? No, sorry, we don't have any. Well, you don't really believe in it, and we can't set up with no money. Now, the more money you pull into it, the better facilities you should get. Now, that doesn't always mean that you're actually going to get that. But the more money you spend on forensics, the better the facilities are going to be. Let's look at the team that's involved in this. It's not just the technicians. We'll talk about the technicians in a minute. It's the cross-department leaders within the organization. It's the decision makers within the organization that have the power of the pen, the power of the budget, the power to lose and make money based on the decisions that we have here. It's the legal people that are going to stop you from litigation, or maybe they go ahead and start litigation. It's the human resources people that will counsel the person and say, hey, you need to change your attitude and your behavior toward the organization, otherwise you don't want to work here anymore. And then the other people that you want to talk about are the external. How will you interact with law enforcement? Do you do that locally? Do you do that with the FBI, Department of Justice? It all depends on also your regulations that you have to follow. And then finally, how are you going to tell the rest of the world that this is going on externally? It may be that you are required because you had a breach within your organization and your customer database was exposed, and that customer database also had payment card information within it. You may be required through public affairs to acknowledge this publicly and let these people actually know. Let's switch to that technical team. Now, it's not just you and me in a lab with our stuff. Okay? You've got an evidence manager. You've got a documenter. That would probably be you and I. I'd be writing it down, and you'd be doing it. Okay, well, what are we going to do next? Okay, fine, you're doing that. Okay, hold on a second. Let me write this thing down. You also may have an investigator. That's a person that goes out in the field. That investigator may also learn to collect evidence from victims and also from attackers. And then that would be interviewing versus interrogating. And then you also may have a photographer that you do this with. A photographer documents the scene in a lot of cases. I know that would sound silly to take pictures of a computer, but that's really sometimes what it's going to take to actually get your evidence admitted in a court of law. Now, the big thing that we run into is jurisdictions in law. And we have to know about what our synchronization with the local district attorney is, with the local law enforcement is, making sure that if we do ask to do a search, that we are within our rights and within the scope that is reasonable for our organization. We're going to check those applicable federal statutes, and then we're going to know when to connect with and talk to the local legal authorities. And by the way, there's a very simple rule that I've learned in dealing with law enforcement. Start local. Don't go all the way to the state or all the way to the federal government. Say, okay, what are your capabilities here? Remember, we did in advance, we talked to these people at the local HTCIA meeting where we all interacted and say, okay, I know you're my point of contact, but this looks bigger because it's global and it goes beyond just our location here. We've got it in 10 different places. We wanted to come to you first because we found it here, but can you help us and escalate us up through the chain of command? Go through the chain of command for law enforcement. That's respectful of them. You're going to need those people later on, so respect their way of doing things.